Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of the Empathy Conversations. My name is Haifa Staiti. I am the Executive Director of Empathy for Peace. We're an organization that aims to build peaceful communities by connecting the research to practical peace-building efforts and initiatives around the world. Today, I am joined by three amazing women, Lucha, Gabby, and Angie, and we are going to be talking about children and youth and their role in peacebuilding. Welcome, ladies. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Amazing. Maybe we'll start by having everyone introduce yourself. If you can tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, and then we'll dive into the conversations. So maybe I'll start from the order on my screen. So maybe Lucha, can you go first?
Sure, thank you. I am Lucha Sotomayor. I work for the Office of the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Violence Against Children. It's a very long name. I specifically focus on children's participation. That means how children are helping to prevent, address, and report violence, and how children are being part of the solutions. I'm also a mom, so I have two empowered children myself. I am an author of children's books. One is called Yo Digital, Me Digital, which is a guide to be the best version of yourself online, and another one called Yo Activista. I'm an activist, and that it's kind of like a guide to achieve social change, whether small or big, through peace as well. And I'm a director of an NGO in Chile called Todo Mejora, which helps address adolescent mental health concerns from the LGBTIQ community. So that's me.
Wow, amazing. And I'm already in my mind, there's three other conversations I want to have with you in the future. So awesome. Gabby, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, of course. So my name is Gabriela Paravini. I'm originally from Brazil, but right now I'm based at the University of Oxford as a postdoctoral researcher. And my background is very mixed. It combines psychology, ethics, digital innovation, psychiatry. And my most recent work focuses on young people's participation in promoting well-being and mental health innovations and interventions for mental health and well-being. So I study their aspirations for participation, how we can enable better participation in those processes, and I also test interventions that are led and developed by young people. And in addition to this research work, I'm also a coordinator of the Lancet Young Leaders for Global Mental Health, and that is more on the advocacy side. So I also do quite a bit of public engagement around mental health and advocacy around mental health, fighting for better well-being, and of course that is all related to peace as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Angie, last but not least.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm Angelica Ponguta. You can call me Angie. And I am a researcher at the Yale Child Study Center. I am originally from Colombia. And our work at Yale centers around early childhood development, all things early childhood development, all the way from the intervention development and intervention evaluation side, but more importantly, how to translate those innovations and interventions into policy and into sustainable financing for young children around the world. All of our work is done in low middle income countries. More recently, we've entered the space of early childhood education in emergencies and humanitarian contexts. And I also recently, which is I think what has brought Gabby and Lucha and I together, have also started exploring this issue of intergenerational programming and research. So how do we connect adolescent and youth development with early childhood, and yet one more layer of interconnectedness, which is peace building. And I think this will come up throughout the conversation, but the movement that actually brought us together, of which Yale is one of the co-founders of, is the Early Childhood Peacebuilding Consortium, which is a collective of organizations that has worked for a few years now on leveraging early childhood development and peace building. And again, how can we interconnect youth development, empowerment, and participation in that as well? So that's who I am and how the three of us, I think, came together, which might provide some context.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, because I was going to say I have been hoping to get to speak to the three of you for a while now. I know a dear friend of mine and a common friend, Dr. Jim Leckman, has been telling me, you have to talk to Lucha, Gabby, and Angie. You have to talk to them. And now I understand why. I mean, you guys are an amazing team doing such amazing and fascinating work. So I'm so happy to have you here today. And so we wanted to talk about children, youth, and peace building. And the first question that came to mind is really, what can children bring to peace building? I mean, when we hear about peace building and we talk about peace building, I imagine, diplomats signing agreements, adults doing their own thing. We don't often hear about the children or talk about the children other than, I went to peace camp as a child, dialogue programs and things like that. But it wasn't really integrated in the peace building process. It was more like, the cherry on the top, the little thing that makes us all feel better about, what's going on. But you guys are actually giving this thought, and you're working really hard at integrating and involving the children and the youth from the beginning. So my question is, why and what can children bring to peace building processes around the world?
I can take the first stab from the perspective of children's participation, right? And I'm just going to take a step back to talk about what that means. A bit over 30 years ago, child participation became a concept that the world embraced, right? Children, before the conventions of the right of the child, didn't have the right to express themselves, the right to access information, the right to peaceful assembly, etc. And all these rights combined give us what we understand today as children's participation, right? Children have the right to be consulted and participate in all matters that affect them, peace building being one of them. That's why I wanted to give that intro. Now, this concept has also evolved so much together with children who have evolved, right? A more conventional understanding would be, let's consult children. Let's ask them what they think. You don't really know if those opinions are going to be taken into consideration, if they're going to be influencing decision-making, right? And on the opposite end, we would have children as partners sitting with decision makers, being able to influence decision making. But that doesn't just happen overnight, right? There's a lot of things that need to be in place for children to be able to be considered as partners and be able to influence decision making. What we have been seeing is children being every day more informed, receiving capacity building. There's been a lot of knowledge transfer, so children can be part of processes from identifying which are the problems that affect them, and in regions of the world where peace building is a challenge, that's one of the problems that they will identify. This is something that does affect me and my peers and my communities, all throughout identifying solutions. So I think, not to take too long because I could speak forever about this, but I think that first we need to understand that children have agency, that children can influence decision making, that they can be part of the solutions, and that they are being part of the solutions. When they do receive the knowledge needed to influence decision making, they will train adults, they will reach their peers, they will engage others and involve their peers and their adult communities. We have seen with COVID so much that when offline support systems were disconnected, children became an essential means to reach other children, right? And also a key component in the chain of knowledge transfer, including in peace building processes. They would be sometimes in some regions focal points for organizations to reach them because they would be in touch with their peers, etc., and they would transmit the information to the adults, to their parents, to their communities. There's a beautiful example in South Sudan of adolescent journalists who would go out and research the community needs to shape their program, their radio program. But not only would they then respond through the radio program with suggestions, with solutions within peace building processes, but they would even take speakers to isolated areas to make sure that those who were not connected could also receive the information. So they have agency, and we need to trust them and partner with them. Over to my colleagues.
Yeah, I think something, just to follow up on what Lucha said, I think we need to think about children and adolescents, like not put them in a sort of siloed position, how you say, right? Like, oh, there is an event where policymakers are going to be, we want children on a side event, right? Mm-hmm. And doing their own thing and connecting with one another only, right? We need to start building those bridges. And I think what's interesting as well when we talk about how can children and adolescents contribute is that I think we can only provide very generic responses to this question and then let them tell us how they can contribute. Because something that I've learned working with adolescents is that they always have much better ideas than you could come up with yourself as an adult. Like they're seeing the world in a different way. They offer really fresh solutions that are going to involve, means that the adults don't have to think about and connections that the adults don't have. So I think it's really important for us as adults, really our role should be to enable that and to provide them with the tools for them to be able to generate the solutions together with us. But yeah, it shouldn't be our role to sort of tell them what they should be doing exactly.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And I guess I'll just very briefly also complement, because I think you've both covered really the essence of where we have sort of thought of youth and peace building and children all interconnected. But I think sort of the complementary perspective that we offer is, and we might need to sort of deconstruct a little bit what we actually mean by peace building in a way, because there's very different ways of conceptualizing it, operationalizing it. I think, developmental psychologists think of peace and culture of peace in one way. Human rights activists might think of it another way. Part of what we are trying to do at Yale is actually break those kind of language silos and disciplinary silos for us to really try to have conversations like these, where we're sitting all around the table, trying to understand very complex multifactorial issues. And so I'll just offer a definition of peace building that is sort of two-pronged. The first, there's of course like reactive components, right, of peace building. So when there's an existing conflict, there are natural social divisions, prejudices, forms of discrimination, inequities that emerge. And we as a society react to that. Then the other component of it are the proactive components, right, where we seek to engage communities to reduce the risk, right, of that conflict emerging and addressing really the root cause. And I think here it's very intuitive that everything sort of starts with the family unit, with the child, with how that child is raised, how she and he learn how to view the world. And that's when we are able to promote mutual understanding and respect. And we can talk a little bit about the development of empathy, from a human development perspective, but it's just very intuitive, right? That's where it begins, the principles of inclusion, but also, it's not on them. The onus is not on the child. The onus is on us to create a system that, that allows for opportunities, right, for their own economic, social, personal, human development. And another concept that I'm going to come back to, and I think in the conversation we're going to come back to, which is a subcomponent of peace building, is this idea of social cohesion. So social cohesion really is at the heart of what we do, because it's this sort of construct where, peace is really our ability to connect across communities and across groups, and also live like in peace with the institutions, right, that provide those structures. And we believe that early childhood development, youth development are a natural conduit to that cohesion. And again, as the conversation evolves, I can share some specific examples as to, how do we conceptualize that, and how, from an almost scientific perspective, we're trying to convince the peace builders that this sort of, again, proactive form of peace building and culture of peace resides in the home, in the family, in the young person, and in the young child.
Amazing. I really like all these different perspectives. And I think in my mind, when I think of peace building, I think similarly, I think to what you, Angie, were saying, but, different words that I use are, one way is to build peace is to stop the violence, so ending violence as a peace building. And then another way is to prevent it, so that we never actually get to conflicts and wars and discrimination and all these things that disturb the peace. And I think it comes naturally to think about children and youth as a preventative way of building peace. And I can see where early childhood development can play a role in that. I think where I found it, like where I learned new things is, can and do children and youth have a role in peace building that aims to stop violence and stop conflicts that are already happening. So we can talk about both of those components, and if you have ideas about how do we involve children in either kind of the peace building types that we've mentioned right now, that would be great to hear more about that.
I can talk a bit about the broader violence component and how children are being part of preventing and stopping, and how empathy fits into that, because I think it's a critical component, and it's a beautiful angle as well. So I'm gonna give you an example of how empathy helps. I would say prevent further violence and stop violence happening. My example is related to bullying, actually, peer-to-peer violence, right? So, it's a common mistake to think that the child who is the bully is the aggressor, right? When in fact, a child who's a bully is also a victim of some other form of, it could be violence, verbal violence, mental distress. Something is happening to that child that provokes him or her to bully another child, right? And actually, the example that I'm going to give you is a personal one. It's from my own daughter. About a year ago, she told me that another girl was bullying her at school. And she said, "Mom, you always tell me that if I'm being a victim of bullying, I need to talk to an adult. So that's what I'm doing. I'm talking to you." And we started talking about the other girl, the girl who was bullying her, who was in fact bullying her. It wasn't a very aggressive bullying, but it was repeated throughout time. And then I told her, that if she's bullying you, it's not that she has something against you, but probably she's going through something herself, right? That's called empathy, right? That is relating to somebody else's feelings, circumstances, etc. My daughter's reaction was because the teachers suggested, they suggested to have a mediated conversation between the girls, and us parents said, let children figure this out first. And her reaction was to tell the teacher. So my mom works in bullying, and she told me that when a child bullies another one, it's because something is happening to that child. So she asked the other girl, "What's happening? Are you okay? What's wrong?" Right? If you think of it, it's quite funny, 2 8-year-olds talking about their problems, and how that triggered her behavior, but it solved the situation. They were able to address some of the things that were happening to them, to both of them, and they were able to get through them because the conversation encouraged empathy components, encouraged looking for a solution, conflict resolution. Many of these technical or technicalities that we know that would that are in place in peace building scenarios, when it comes to addressing violence, they're a very similar concept, right? And I just love that these conversations are called empathy conversations, because when you bring empathy into the conversation, you help prevent and respond, right? That was a specific scenario where violence, what was happening in some degree, it helped stop it and probably prevent other scenarios, because that girl was in fact, she was adopted, she was going through personal things, and she was bullying other girls as well. So it wasn't just that specific situation. And in helping stop violence, we last year our mandate mapped children's participation in times of COVID around preventing and responding and addressing violence. And one of the things that we saw was how important peer networks were in educating around violence. When children take part in participation activities, they bond and they create relationships. And from those relationships, when they interact, we could see that, for example, children in Guatemala with children in Argentina who became close, at some point, one of them told the other, what you're experiencing, it's called violence. That's not normal. You shouldn't be experiencing that. And children educating one another and helping put a stop to different violence scenarios. That's why I wanted to talk a bit more broadly about violence, because I think these examples can be taken to other circumstances like peace-building processes. And as Angie was saying, there are different understandings of the term as well, depending on so many factors. But the fact that, when empathy is part of the conversation, it does help children both prevent, stop, and address. So it's something that we should encourage at very young ages, because if we have empowered and empathetic young children, we're going to have empowered adolescents and empowered youth and empowered adults, empathetic and looking to achieve peace, which I think it's the longer goal.
Well, what a beautiful example of empathy as a way to build more peaceful communities. And I love that example. I know I'm a student in social work, and in social work, we always say hurt people. And so like trying to understand where someone is coming from in all circumstances is really helpful and important. I also really like the point about educating children about violence. Again, that's something, I often, I can relate to having grown up in a conflict zone and being subjected to a lot of violence at home and in the community, is not knowing that what you're going through is not normal. And then not realizing, that your responses and the way you're behaving are actually normal responses to very abnormal situations. And, it wasn't until I was an adult and I learned about childhood trauma that I finally kind of took that shame off myself and understood that the way that I was feeling, the way I behaved was normal reactions to very abnormal situations. And had I learned that, I think as a child, first of all, I would have felt less lonely and probably, would have saved myself a lot of grief growing up. So I really do think that's a very important point to make. My question is, and I think you started answering it a little bit, Lucha, is what do the children themselves gain from being involved in these efforts from the beginning, and how does teaching children about these things impact, the way they grow up and how then they influence communities when they're older?
I mean, there's so many pathways through which, participation can benefit children and adolescents themselves. I think something that we know from the literature is that children and adolescents are motivated by a sense of social responsibility, and they are sensitive to injustice from very early on. So we know that these processes are important for young people. So for them, flourishing is not just about their personal benefit, their personal happiness, but it is about the ability to contribute to the community and having access to those spaces. So yeah, what the literature shows is, I could mention a bunch of things, but, greater ability to cope with stress, greater political empowerment, a sense of purpose and identity that comes from engaging with something that matters to you and feeling like you can make a difference, the ability to form meaningful relationships with other children, with adolescents, with adults, and then, the feeling of affecting change that is gonna, be the society you're gonna live in the future. So that matters a lot. And yes, I think I've covered a few. Yeah, I think in our own research, I've done some research on equipping young people with skills to be able to express their agency, and specifically peer support skills. And we found that, just teaching adolescents very basic skills about, where to search for help, how to create rapport with, with a friend, with a peer from your school, how to help them through emotional difficulties, just those basic skills already improve their own well-being, just learning how to manage those situations and improve their own mental health, improve their sense of purpose, improve their self-efficacy. So we see all of these effects just, with, in our case, it was a 5-day course that was teaching them those very basic skills. So just, they were not the receivers of the help, right? They were the sort of providers of the support. And just by having this knowledge of how to help someone else, that already improves their own well-being.
Yeah. Amazing. All of that is making me think, and especially Gabby, the research you just mentioned with the course, it is making me think a lot about early childhood development, education, school systems, the way we parent our children, and how all of that is intimately connected to creating more peaceful communities. Angie, do you want to comment maybe on that and tell us a little bit more? I know you're the expert in this area.
I've presented this work, for instance, in child development conferences. And when I start out by talking about peace building, there's always a little bit of gasping in the audience, right? You're not used to starting a talk. For example, I use a lot the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a language we all kind of rally around. And when I open up the talk with the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, there's always a little bit of a confusion, right? We're all used to talk about Goal 4, which is an education, and that's where early child development is mentioned, and youth education and employment. And really, it is a total paradigm shift. It is to tell the community, the international community, we really have to think about this differently. And this very commonly known fact that the peace starts at home, it starts at home. And we don't have it right as a society yet. It is a combination, I think, of not the most effective communication and advocacy, but I also think it is a failure, I think, of research in a way, in being able to ask the right questions and position the evidence in the right way. And I think, in a way, that's what the consortium wants to do. And what we have tried to do is to generate what we call a theory of change, right? Which is, it's a framework whereby when you have multiple research groups, multiple disciplines trying to kind of sort of zoom in a question, and you work around a framework. And so I just want to offer a little bit about what that framework is, because it sort of tries to spell out what these components are. And that's really answering your question, Haifa, which is, we think that the key input, right, of this entire sort of process is quality early childhood development programs, policies, and services. And that includes holistic development for children. It includes parenting support. And when I talk holistic child development, I mean strong psychosocial support, strong participatory avenues, everything that we know matters, right, for holistic child development. Then you go kind of to the black box of that could be multiple activities. So there could be sort of very vertical interventions. It could be parenting interventions. This is probably where the empathy comes in, right? The empathy work comes in, because empathy really is kind of derived from early childhood attachment, right? And early sort of secure parenting and positive parenting, right? So there's strategies that really tap into these constructs that we know work. But then as a research community, we need to be able to link that to what are the outputs that matter and ultimately the outcomes that matter. And by outputs, I mean, okay, how do we actually prove that those interventions and those activities that stem from, right, those strong early childhood development systems connect with the constructs of peace building that I was mentioning, right? How can we actually show that when you invest here, you're actually driving social cohesion, that you're actually driving sustainable economic and human and social development, and that ultimately that leads to a reduction and a prevention of conflict. And that chain, right, that theory of change, we can all, and we have done that. We've published papers and chapters on this where we take existing evidence and we make those linkages kind of post hoc. What we're trying to do is we need a new generation of research that starts from those premises, right? And that generates short, mid, and long-term results that can answer those questions. And not only that, but then we need to, walk this path with advocates that can help us translate that knowledge and take it where it can be heard, so that we can shift, right, investments for peace building to, almost strict militarization, right, and those efforts, to serious social investment in early childhood and youth development. And so we have a big responsibility, right, to build that evidence and to broker it, to give our children a fair chance, right, in showing that that empathy is not going to break down the minute that they're faced with systems that they need to kind of fight for their own survival.
Yeah. And from what I've seen and heard from you guys and others, we also have a long way to go still. And, in my social work program, I'm learning a lot about childhood trauma and kind of linking trauma with peace building. And I'm learning a lot about adverse childhood experiences. And to me, when I look at the research, I'm amazed by how little we have done to fix this problem. And I think, Angie, you're kind of touching on a part of it is we haven't been able to bring the research across to policy and practice, which is why I like having these kind of conversations to try to bring that. But yeah, there is still so much for us to do. I'm particularly interested in like childhood trauma and intergroup conflict and how that connects to each other. So maybe a topic for another conversation. Now, the big question is, how does COVID-19 and the pandemic affect all of this? How does it affect kind of like the efforts that you guys are working on to try to make things better? How is it affecting children around the world these days? We know it is making things worse for so many children around the world. So that's kind of like the big question. And then a follow-up question is, as we're starting to think about this new normal and moving to, build better, again, what do we need to do? And I know you guys are really good at, looking at the big picture and talking about, on policy level and multi-sectorial level, but I'm also interested in like, Lucha, as a parent, what can I do? I have 2 children also, by the way. So what can we do, small scale as well as bigger scale?
That's a very good question. I'm going to try and be brief because there's so much information around this. We know that COVID has impacted the world and children in unprecedented manners, right? We know that violence against children, unfortunately, violence rates have increased, reporting have decreased, which means that offline reporting systems have been disrupted. Reporting system in 104 countries were disrupted, according to UNICEF. We know, there are very high numbers of children whose education has been affected. We know the main figures, right? So I don't want to go into that, but I want to, stop at children's engagement, children's participation, and something that is very important that we have touched on that, but we haven't referred to it as mental health during this conversation, but the effects of lockdown, of isolation, of fear, of uncertainty on children's mental health has been important. Our office has just released a report on mental health available in our website, unviolenceagainstchildren.org. I think it's our website. I should know that. And one of the things that I found most innovative and uplifting is the fact that children and adolescents are aware of the effects of isolation and lockdown, and they're taking actions around that. There's so many examples of children addressing other children's mental health needs. Young volunteers going through mental health capacity training to be able to reach out to children in distress and encourage children to talk about their feelings, children supporting each other, connecting with relevant services, connecting with helplines. And children have been at the forefront of that. And that has been truly inspiring because we're seeing that this is a generation that doesn't consider mental health as an isolated health problem, but that mental health is as important as physical health. And as a parent, I think for parents, COVID has been so extremely challenging with them working from home and probably children at home and parents being stressed and being scared with uncertainty that's transmitted to children. What I did with my kids was my oldest was being very aggressive with my youngest. He was very short-tempered, immediately recurring to violence, which is completely prohibited at home. And instead of grounding him, go to your room, we sat down and we talked. And I remember asking him, I know that we have been at home for 2 months. We spent 6 months of lockdown here in Chile, literally 6 months of lockdown. So it was 2 months in, and I asked him, how are you? Like, what's going on? And he said, I am stressed. He was 10. I am stressed. I'm under stress. Okay, all right. That's a term that I didn't know when I was 10, stress. And I asked him, okay, what does that mean? What does stress mean? Because sometimes we kind of assume that children know their emotions, back and forth. And I think as parents, one of our roles and responsibilities is to teach children about our emotions. What you're feeling is anger. What you're feeling is frustration. What you're feeling is shame. Because when children are very young, it's either a good emotion or a bad emotion. But then within the good emotions and within the bad emotions, there's a wide range of emotions. And it's our role to teach them to identify which is the emotion that they're experiencing and what they can do about it. So we broke down a bit what stress was. And it was very much in line with all the evidence that we were seeing globally. He was scared. He didn't know what he didn't know what was going to happen, and that frightened him a lot. He missed his friends, he missed his family. He was sick of our faces, of course. And I think one of the challenges that we're facing today is how can we get that message across to very stressed parents, right? Very tired parents who are experiencing uncertainty, experiencing loss of their jobs, economic impacts. We have seen that because of the economic impacts of the pandemic, violence has increased as well.
Yeah, I think Lucha covered it all really, but I think just one point which I think is a really sad legacy of COVID-19 is like this huge sense of loss that I see when I talk to any child or adolescent. Many are mourning the loss of family members. They are scared that the close others are gonna maybe be affected by the pandemic. They sort of not only loss of personal and sort of interpersonal loss, but also loss of opportunities, of educational opportunities, of work opportunities. The sort of disparities that we had from a digital point of view, like now they are just so critical because they mean loss of everything. It's not accessing education anymore, not accessing work anymore. So I think all that we're going to have to deal with now. And I think this just like breakdown of the sense of community, right? That normally wouldn't come from an online community. It would come from your actual community, either your school or groups or community groups that you would be part of. So I think it's going to be a huge challenge for us all as parents, as teachers, and as individuals to try and reestablish that sense of community, of the idea that we are together, that we are we're still living in groups, right? We're not just sort of households. So I think this is a huge challenge for us that we need to address.
That's amazing, Gabby and Lucha. Thank you for sharing. And I think we have just a few minutes left, and if I might just end up in on a positive note, and I just want to maybe again offer three opportunities that I have seen in our work, and they might be a little bit sort of discussed from like a policy perspective and a research perspective, what we have confronted with COVID, and then from maybe a social or personal perspective to end up in maybe a little bit of a positive note. But anything from a policy perspective, for the first time that, at least in my lifetime, globally, we're all on the same boat, right? I used to talk about even a humanitarian emergency and what it meant to, children not being able to access school as something that was just so foreign to me, because it was. I can never compare my situation, of course, to somebody who's truly, in a war zone or in an actual, active conflict, but I can relate very differently to what it's like for your child to not be able to go to school. My children could not handle virtual education. I mean, it was really very difficult. And I think things like that offer an incredible opportunity for us to leverage education, early childhood education, youth development in a way that we never had before. And I think, lawmakers all of a sudden are also in the same boat, right? It's an equalizer in a way that maybe the word hasn't been used always very properly. But I think in that regard, when it comes to parent support, when it comes to education, I don't know that we're going to have another window of opportunity like this one. The second area is in terms of research. And I think it's also deconstructed, it challenged a lot of assumptions for all of us researchers for the same reason. We went in with our hypotheses and our ideas of what we need to study and how, and all of a sudden everything has changed. The needs have changed. The research questions have to be reformulated. I mean, I've spent 1 year literally restructuring my entire research portfolio. And it made me think to myself, am I really asking the communities that we work for the questions that need to be addressed in research? So I think there's something there that I'm really, really hoping we have a very short-term memory as a humanity. I really hope this lesson does stick. And then to end on a positive note, like Lucha was sharing with her son, with her children, I think it could be a really interesting opportunity to end up also in empathy, in the conversation of empathy. So, when our children went back to school, my husband and I were petrified with the issue of masking, right? They're 3 and 6, and we thought, oh, what are they going to do? They're not going to wear their masks. It's going to be a disaster. We were more scared than the children. So 2 lessons. 1, children are incredibly adaptable, incredibly resilient. When a behavior change is introduced in a way that is well explained to them, they're extremely compliant, much more than adults, right? And the way that we explained the use of mask, it was a principle of empathy, right? It was, we wear the mask to protect you, but because children have superpowers and they're not as easily infected by COVID, is to protect others, is to protect the clerk at the stores, to protect your teachers, to protect your neighbor. And that opportunity for we're in this together. This is about you as much as it is about the other person. We exercise empathy every day if we choose to, as a parent and as a caregiver. And I wish the conversation, particularly in the United States, was more like that. Really an opportunity for empathy, really an opportunity to grow as a community. And that's how I see it. And so I'm hoping again that these lessons stick, that we think about them in a way that can be constructive and that can really help us again build back something truly better for our children and for our youth in particular.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was so well put, and thank you for helping us kind of end on a positive note, because I know this is a hard topic and there is so much work for everyone to do. And I agree with you. I think as weird as it is, the pandemic has given us an opportunity to learn and practice empathy. In some ways, it has taken, opportunities, right? That the loss of that in person in the community, that's one way we learn about empathy, and that was taken away from us. But in other ways, we were presented with new opportunities. And like you, one example for me is, I grew up with regular curfews because I grew up in Palestine conflict and occupation. So a curfew was something normal. But, I've been in Canada for a very long time, and Canadian people don't know what curfews are, but now they kind of do. So it does make it a little bit easier to relate. And like you, for me, like school closures was normal. For many people, fortunate to live in stable and happy communities, that wasn't a thing. And yes, we may not necessarily know exactly how it feels to be in a conflict zone, but we can now understand what it feels to not be able to go to school, not because you're sick, but because of something out there that's controlling the way you live. And I think that does give us an opportunity to connect around these things and build empathy. And like all of you, I do hope that these lessons stick and that we take them and that we're not having the same conversation, 20 years from now. But I want to thank you so much. This has been amazing. And I know that we just kind of scratched the surface. There is so much to talk about. I hope that we get to have many more conversations to explore all of these different areas more and more. I did make notes of some of the reports and publications that came up, and I will make sure I get those links. And I like to link those with the recording, so people who are watching, if they want to learn more, they can find that. And on that note, I want to thank you so much for being here today.